Kathy sat silently in her small apartment in Seattle, staring out of the window with a heavy heart. A month ago, she had received an urgent call from her best friend, someone she had known for many years. It was a gloomy morning when she learned that her friend had been diagnosed with leukemia. The feeling of shock and worry overwhelmed her mind. Her friend not only needed treatment at a research hospital in Seattle, but also required the help of 2 caregivers throughout the process. And Kathy didn't hesitate to agree. The journey of caring for her friend lasted much longer than expected. What started as a promise of just a few months turned into a nightmare that dragged on for nearly a year. That time was filled with emotional ups and downs. They experienced moments of fleeting hope and deep despair as the treatments failed to bring the desired results. The days filled with a mix of hope and sorrow finally ended when her friend passed away at the age of 53. His death devastated Kathy. She felt as if she were falling into an endless abyss, not knowing how to confront the grief. Both her body and spirit were exhausted, and the prolonged stress pushed her into a serious physical condition. Before long, a severe flu struck, and her already weakened body couldn't withstand it. One day, when her friends took her to a clinic, the doctor couldn't find her pulse and immediately put her in an ambulance, rushing her to the hospital. She was diagnosed with acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, a condition that often proves fatal. The doctors said she had only a 38% chance of survival. Kathy had no other choice. Her family and she agreed to let the doctors put her into a medically induced coma, hoping that they could throw every possible treatment at her to save her life. Before she drifted into sleep, the doctor told her they would use a memory-blocking drug, which would prevent her from remembering anything during the treatment. She would simply fall into a deep sleep, unaware of the world around her. However, when Kathy woke up, she was no longer in the hospital. Around her was an impenetrable darkness. She couldn't hear anything except the loud thumping of her heart in her chest. Her mind raced, trying to figure out where she was. She wasn't scared, but a sense of confusion and being lost took over. Where am I? The question echoed in her mind, but there was no answer. Kathy tried to focus. Slowly within the darkness, a faint reddish glow began to appear. She thought that perhaps the sun was rising, bringing a bit of light so she could see where she was. But the light didn't grow stronger. It only flickered weakly in the gloomy space. A thick fog began to envelop her, and the air became oppressively hot, making it hard to breathe. The stench of something rotten assaulted her nose, causing her to gasp for air. Then, terrifying sounds echoed from afar. Screams of agony, disturbing shrieks reverberated through the dark space. A shiver ran down Kathy's spine, and she realized that she was lost in a place entirely separate from the real world. This can't be a good place, she thought to herself. And then, a voice boomed from within the fog. Do you know where you are? Kathy's heart seemed to stop. She tried to think, but all she could come up with was, hell. And the voice, cold and echoing in the space, laughed maniacally. Yes, hell, the voice replied, and that crazed laughter sent chills down her entire body. Without thinking much, Kathy turned and began running for her life. She ran through the darkness, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she needed to escape. The terrifying sounds continued to surround her, and she couldn't escape the fear rising within her. Suddenly, a blinding light appeared, pulling her out of the darkness. Kathy realized she was now standing in the middle of a desolate, ruined city. Tall buildings had collapsed. Massive chunks of concrete were scattered everywhere. Explosions echoed from a distance, and fires raged in the sky. Where on earth is this? Kathy wondered, her mind filled with confusion. She tried to find shelter, but the place wasn't safe. Strange sounds, like the clanging of metal and the screeches of unknown creatures, filled the air. Kathy couldn't make out what they were, but it was clear that something was watching her. A massive shadow glided past, heightening her anxiety. Then, from the darkness, a group of people emerged. They wore ragged clothing, looking like survivors of some apocalyptic event. They stared at Kathy with cold, piercing eyes, and she felt completely unsafe. "I need to find a way out of here," she thought, then began running toward a crumbled building, hoping to find refuge. Kathy felt her heart pounding in her chest as she dashed toward the crumbling building in front of her. The windows were shattered, the walls were marred with dust and dirt, and the entire city seemed to be shrouded in an atmosphere haunted by the remnants of war. Each of her steps grew heavier, not because her body was tired, but because of the overwhelming fear that enveloped her. Strange sounds continued to echo in the air, screams, the clash of metal, and even distant murmurs from unknown sources. Just as she approached the building, her foot caught on a piece of concrete, causing her to tumble to the ground. Pain shot up her back as it collided with the cold, hard ground. Kathy wanted to get back up and keep running, but her body no longer obeyed her. In that brief moment, she looked up and saw the towering figure of a strange creature slowly moving through the crumbling buildings. Metal scraping against metal emanated from it, creating an eerie sound. "Damn it," Kathy cursed under her breath. "What is that?" The creature looked like something from her worst nightmares. Its form was unclear, but it appeared to be a large, hairy being with glowing red eyes gliding through the shadows. She couldn't make out its entire shape, but its mere presence was enough to paralyze her with fear. Kathy tried to crawl backward, but each of her movements grew slower. She had no idea how to escape this situation. She didn't know where to go. There was no one to help, and she was certain that this place was not of the mortal world. "This really is hell," she thought, trying to distance herself from the creature. She didn't dare make a sound, just hoping the creature wouldn't notice her. Suddenly a voice broke the silence. But this time it wasn't the voice that echoed in her head like before. It was clear, calm, and held a hint of mystery. "Do you want to get out of here?" Kathy jumped. She looked up and saw a creature standing right in front of her. It had a vaguely human shape but was covered in coarse fur, with deep, menacing eyes. Its gaze was cold and sharp, making it impossible for her to look away. It didn't seem to have any intention of attacking her, but it was clearly something she didn't want to deal with. Where is this?" Kathy asked, her voice trembling. The creature gave a small, cruel smile, its thin lips curving slightly. "You already know. This is hell." Kathy's heart raced again. She didn't know what to say, only feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She couldn't react, couldn't run away. "Why aren't you running anymore? Too scared?" the creature asked, still holding that malicious grin. "I don't want to be here," Kathy replied, trying to muster some courage. "I want to get out of here." The creature looked at her calmly, then said, "I have a task for you. If you complete it, I will personally ensure you escape from here." Kathy listened to these words with some doubt. She didn't know if she could trust this creature, but she had no other choice. Everything seemed to be against her, and this offer might be her only way out. "What task?" she asked, hoping the answer wouldn't be too terrifying. The creature turned and gestured with its hand, revealing a vast field in front of her, filled with tall bushes intertwined with one another. The bushes stood nearly 3 meters high, their branches tangled into a thick green wall covered with sharp thorns. "You just need to cut down all these bushes," the creature said in a monotonous tone, "and I'll ensure you get out." Kathy looked at the dense field of bushes before her, then turned to the creature with a skeptical look. "That's it? Just cut down these bushes?" The creature nodded, but instead of handing her a useful tool, it gave her a tiny pair of scissors, the kind children would use for arts and crafts. She looked at the tiny scissors, then up at the creature, disbelief written all over her face. "Are you kidding me?" she blurted out. The creature burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the empty space as if it were mocking her smallness and helplessness. You have no other choice. Either you do this, or you'll be stuck here forever. With no other path available, Kathy took the tiny scissors and began to cut into the thorny branches. The branches were thick, covered with sharp thorns that pricked her hands, drawing blood. But she gritted her teeth and endured, determined to complete the task. Bit by bit, Kathy tried to cut through a large branch, but just as she finished and turned to toss it aside, she noticed that the branch had already grown back, exactly as it was before, in the blink of an eye. She looked at the creature in frustration, and it merely smiled, crossing its arms as if enjoying a cruel joke. "Don't waste your time. You'll never escape from here," the creature sneered. "You're just wasting your effort." But Kathy didn't give up. She bent down, starting to cut more branches, hoping to find a way out of the situation. But every time she cut a branch, it immediately grew back. Exhaustion and despair began to seep into her muscles, but she didn't stop. After many hours had passed, the light around her began to change. She realized that she was no longer standing in the middle of the bush field, but had been transported to an entirely different place. Kathy found herself in a long hallway, with stark white walls surrounding her. The ceiling was high, and bright neon lights illuminated the entire corridor. The air was cold and still, a stark contrast to the nightmare she had just endured. She glanced around and then noticed another creature standing at the far end of the hallway. Like before, this creature also had the form of a demon, with glowing red eyes and a large staff in its hand. It looked at her, then quickly moved toward her with surprising speed. Kathy felt tension building. "What am I supposed to do now?" she wondered, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape route. But there was nothing. Both sides of the hallway were lined with tightly closed doors, and she wasn't sure what would happen if she opened any of them. "You have a new task," the creature said as it approached her. "What task?" Kathy asked, hoping this time it wouldn't be another hopeless mission. "You will go into that room, retrieve an item, and carry it down this hallway to place it in the room on the left." Kathy looked at the creature with a doubtful gaze, but she had no other option. She had to comply. She stepped into the room the creature had indicated, and found it to be vast, with rows of hospital beds lined up. On each bed lay an unmoving person, and next to each bed stood a doctor. The scene resembled a hospital, but it was far from peaceful, instead filled with a chilling sense of dread. One of the doctors turned to look at her, his hands covered in blood. "Come here," he ordered. Reluctantly, Kathy stepped forward, not knowing what would happen next. Kathy stepped into the large room, where the air felt heavy and oppressive. The light from the ceiling lamps made the room seem cold and unfamiliar. In front of her, rows of hospital beds were lined up, with each bed holding a motionless person. Doctors stood beside the beds, but they didn't resemble the doctors she had known. There was no professionalism, only a sense of apathy. Kathy's heart beat faster as she drew closer. A doctor standing by the nearest bed, his hands soaked in blood, waved her over. "Come here," he said, his voice cold. Kathy hesitated, but she had no other choice. She walked toward him, the feeling of fear overwhelming her thoughts. As she neared him, she saw a woman lying on the hospital bed, her face pale and still. The doctor quickly handed Kathy something soaked in blood that she couldn't quite identify. "Take this down the hall and place it in the room on the left," he said without even looking at her. Kathy held the object in her hands, the wet and heavy sensation making her shiver. She left the room and walked toward the hallway the creature had previously pointed out to her. The hallway was long and brightly lit, but it didn't alleviate the suffocating feeling she was experiencing. She entered the room on the left, where the doctor had directed her. This room was large and filled with stacks of objects identical to the one she was holding. Kathy took a deep breath and placed the item on the ground, trying to suppress the fear that was overwhelming her. After completing the task, she returned to the hallway and saw the creature waiting there, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It didn't say anything, only motioned for her to go back and continue the task. Kathy knew this wasn't right. It was wrong and senseless, but she had no other choice. A sense of helplessness consumed her mind. "No," Kathy exclaimed. "I can't do this anymore. This is terrible and meaningless." The creature looked at her indifferently, then shrugged. "You have no idea what you're bringing upon yourself. This is the path you must walk, or you'll never escape this place." It raised its staff as if preparing to punish her for her defiance. Kathy squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the pain that was about to come. But instead of feeling pain, she felt everything turn to darkness. When Kathy opened her eyes, she found herself standing on a barren dirt road. The road stretched endlessly in front of her, flanked by hills of sand and rock. There was no sunlight, only a faint glow like a distant fire burning on the horizon, but it wasn't strong enough to illuminate the entire scene. There were no signs of life around her, just a vast, silent void. She began walking, not knowing where she was going, but there was no other option. She only knew that she had to keep moving. With each step, the road seemed to stretch farther and farther, and she couldn't see an end in sight. Kathy felt like she was stuck on a giant treadmill. No matter how far she walked, she couldn't get anywhere. Kathy kept walking for what felt like forever, and she began to lose track of time. In this place, there was no concept of time. She didn't know how long she had been walking. All she knew was that everything seemed to repeat itself. The road remained unchanged, still just an endless stretch of dirt. She no longer felt hunger or thirst, but the mental exhaustion and weariness grew with every step. After a while, Kathy smelled something unfamiliar but pleasant. It felt as though something was drawing her forward, a familiar and comforting scent. She quickened her pace, hoping to finally find something different. Before her, a strange scene appeared. On the left was a man sitting on a small chair, looking ordinary, but with eyes cold as if they didn't belong to this world. On the right was a woman, busy preparing a large banquet table overflowing with food, from luxurious dishes to sparkling pastries. The banquet seemed to be set for a grand celebration. Kathy recognized the woman preparing the feast. It was a close relative of hers. This sense of familiarity brought a slight relief. But when Kathy approached and greeted her, the woman looked at her with a distant, unfamiliar gaze. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could you spare me a small plate of food and a glass of water?" Kathy asked gently, hoping for some help. The woman looked up at her, her eyes empty and cold. "This feast is not for you," she said, then turned her back and resumed her work. The words hit Kathy like a blow to her mind, making her feel small and worthless. She apologized and quickly returned to the road, walking in disappointment and confusion. Kathy continued her journey along the endless road, and everything seemed to get worse. This time, she saw a group of people appear in the distance. They walked slowly, their clothes ragged, and their eyes dull. These people didn't look like the living, but they weren't mindless spirits either. Kathy felt uneasy, but didn't dare stop. She told herself, if I walk slowly, maybe they won't notice me. She tried to mimic their pace, lowering her head and walking slowly, hoping to go unnoticed. However, as she got closer, they all stopped and turned to face her. They slowly approached, and Kathy could feel the threat in the air. One of them came close and pushed her hard in the chest, causing her to fall to the ground. The people around her seemed to close in all at once, surrounding her. Fear overwhelmed her. But in that moment, another creature appeared and drove the group away. This creature led Kathy down another road, where she would face even more challenges. Kathy was led down a winding path, covered in darkness and unimaginable cold. She felt each step sinking into the thick snow beneath her feet. An icy wind swept across her, slicing through her skin like knives. She looked around and found herself in a desolate, frozen wasteland, stretching as far as the eye could see. Snow blanketed everything, forming a thick layer that made it hard to move. Bare branches jutted out from the snow like the bony hands of a forsaken world. Along with her was a group of other people, also trudging slowly forward. Everyone was dressed in ragged clothing, their eyes hollow and their expressions weary. Kathy glanced around, unsure where this group had come from, but it was clear they were all enduring the same suffering as she was. Leading the group was an older woman, her face weathered and her body frail, as if worn down by endless snowstorms. She didn't say a word, only silently guided the group through the icy wasteland. The biting wind relentlessly whipped against Kathy. She tried to pull her thin coat tighter, but it didn't help much. The cold penetrated deep into her bones, making her body shiver uncontrollably. Still, she knew she couldn't stop. No one in the group spoke, no one complained, but all of them were dragged along by the relentless flow of unending pain. Kathy could only bow her head and keep walking, following the woman at the front. With every step, Kathy felt herself losing track of time. In this place, there was no concept of day or night. The white snow covered everything, unchanging. She had no idea how long she had been walking, only that each step felt like an endless journey. At times, she felt as though she was walking in a never-ending loop, as if there was no way out. After what seemed like an immeasurable amount of time, the group finally stopped in front of a dilapidated wooden house. The house looked as though it might collapse at any moment, with rotting wooden walls and shattered windows. The woman leading the group motioned for everyone to go inside. Kathy followed the group into the house, hoping for some warmth, but the inside was no better. The cold wind still seeped through the cracks in the walls and windows, and there was no sign of life other than the people with her. Everyone sat down on the cold, hard floor, huddling against the biting cold. Kathy sat in a corner, observing her surroundings. Everything was eerily silent and strange. She wanted to ask someone a question, but no one dared to speak. The air in the room was oppressive, the silence heavy and frightening. Kathy didn't know what to expect next, but she sensed that this place was not safe. Suddenly, the woman leading the group broke the chilling silence with her raspy voice. "We will wait here until a customer arrives." The group bowed their heads, not reacting at all. Kathy felt confused, but she didn't dare ask further. She looked around the dilapidated wooden house, wondering who the customer the woman mentioned could be. Then she turned to look outside through the broken window. The snow still fell, and the wind howled, but there was no sign that anyone would come. Time passed slowly, and a growing sense of despair began to consume Kathy. She felt like this place was a prison with no escape, cold, bleak, and filled with eerie mysteries. She tried to control the rising panic, but with every passing moment, fear crept deeper into her heart. Then, the woman spoke again, her voice cold and rigid. "Today is Christmas on Earth." The statement made Kathy jump. "Christmas?" she muttered. In this place, the concept of time seemed non-existent, but the thought of Christmas made her recall her past life, the warm and happy moments. But then, the woman continued, her tone growing heavier. "Christmas is the worst day here. It's the day we all suffer more than at any other time." Kathy felt the coldness in the woman's words, but she didn't want to accept the darkness they were facing. She wanted to fight against the fear, to fight against the despair. In that moment, an idea sparked in her mind. She began to sing a Christmas hymn, "Away in a Manger," one of her favorite songs. Her voice was weak, but it still echoed in the silent room. "Shut up," the woman screamed, her eyes burning with anger as she glared at Kathy. But Kathy didn't stop. She kept singing, her voice seeming to spread warmth through the freezing room. The others in the group began to look at her. A few even smiled faintly, a small glimmer of hope lighting up their eyes. The woman rushed toward Kathy, furious and wild, but before she could reach her, a brilliant light flooded the room. The light was radiant, warm, and filled with love. Kathy closed her eyes, feeling the warmth wash over her body. It was a sensation she had never experienced before, a feeling of absolute peace and tranquility. All the fear and despair seemed to melt away in that moment. When she opened her eyes, the light was still there, but it was no longer blinding. It was gentle and soothing, bringing a sense of calm. The world around her began to change. The dilapidated wooden house was gone, no more cold wind or falling snow. Instead, she stood in a space filled with light, as if she had stepped into a pristine white temple, with marble walls and floors. Everything was peaceful, and Kathy felt surrounded by boundless love. In front of her, a familiar figure appeared. It was her best friend, the one who had passed away from leukemia. He looked healthy, much younger than the last time she had seen him. His smile was bright, and his eyes were filled with joy. Kathy felt a strange sense of peace, but at the same time, she began to realize that her journey wasn't over yet. Kathy stood still in the pure white space, surrounded by a feeling of serenity, peace enveloping her soul. She had never felt so light and at ease. Gentle light filled everything, giving her the sensation of floating in a river of infinite love, with no worries or fears left to hold her. She looked ahead and saw her best friend smiling at her. He looked so young, healthy, and entirely different from the painful and sickly image she had last seen of him. His smile was full of joy, and his presence brought Kathy an overwhelming sense of familiarity and love. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Kathy smiled, feeling as though all the pain she had ever experienced had vanished. "I'm fine," she replied. "But where is this? Where are we?" He stepped closer, his eyes filled with tenderness and understanding. "We're in a better place," he said. "A place where there is no pain, no fear. This is where you will find the peace you've always been searching for." Kathy felt a surge of joy, but inside her, a sense of uncertainty lingered. "But will I stay here forever? We'll never have to go back to that world of suffering, right?" He looked at her with sad eyes, then gently shook his head. "No, Kathy, you can't stay here yet. You still have work to do there. You can't stop now." Kathy's heart sank as she heard those words. She had endured so much pain and hardship, and all she wanted now was to remain in this peaceful place with her best friend. She didn't want to return to the world she had just escaped, a place full of darkness and demons. "But I don't want to go back," she said, her voice rising in defiance. "I've had enough. I just want to be here with you." He smiled sadly and placed his hand on her shoulder. "I know," he said, "but it's not your time yet. You still have so much to accomplish. You can't give up." Kathy felt a strong wave of resistance rise within her. She didn't want to hear those words. She had suffered enough pain and loss. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to face that dark world again. "I don't want to," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go back." He continued to smile, but now his smile carried a hint of helplessness. "I understand, Kathy, but you have to return. That world still needs you." She looked into his eyes, and in that moment, she realized he was right. Even though she didn't want to, even though she was exhausted and worn out, she couldn't give up. She still had a purpose, an unfinished mission. Kathy bowed her head, a tear rolling down her cheek. She knew she had to return, but that didn't ease her pain. She felt her heart breaking as she realized that the dream of this peace was only temporary. "You'll be okay," he said, his voice filled with reassurance. "You'll find your way. And when you've completed your mission, we'll meet again here, where there is no more pain or fear." Kathy looked at him one last time, trying to etch his image into her memory. She didn't want to forget, didn't want to part from her best friend, but she knew it was time to go. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll miss you." He nodded, his eyes shining with hope. I'll miss you too. But I'll always be here, waiting for you to return. And then, in that moment, the light began to fade. Kathy felt her body becoming lighter, as if she were slowly drifting away from this warm space. She tried to hold on to the feeling of peace, but everything gradually became distant and dark. The gentle light disappeared, replaced by faint images and unfamiliar sounds. When Kathy opened her eyes, she realized she was lying on a hospital bed. Around her were medical devices, and several family members stood beside her. They looked at her with eyes full of surprise and joy. "Mom's awake," a familiar voice exclaimed. Kathy looked around and saw her daughter standing by the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We thought we lost you." Kathy felt weak, but her mind was still filled with the images and emotions from the journey she had just been through. She couldn't find the words to speak, but in her heart she knew she had returned. She had much more to do, and even though she had gone through terrible things, she would continue to live, to complete the tasks that fate had assigned her. Lying in the bed, Kathy felt a new sense of purpose take hold of her soul. She had survived the harshest trials, and now she knew she still had many things to accomplish in this world. Though her journey wasn't over, she believed that one day, when everything was complete, she would be reunited with her best friend, in a place where light and peace awaited her.